Hi everyone. So hope you're doing well and Happy New Year. So my name is Iqbal Chaudhry and I'm absolutely thrilled to have you here in the fourth installment of Fireside Management Chat. So for those who are new to this, this is a lecture series that we have started last year, and the idea is to help members of this community answer some of the burning questions related to management consulting and interviewing and casing. So we invite people from both academia and industry to do that. Today, we have a very special guest with us. His name is Manu Lakshmanan, and I'll just briefly introduce him to you, and he'll talk about casing today. So Manu is a PhD, has a PhD in biomedical engineering, and he has done his postdoc at NIH. uh, Manu was a former management consultant at McKinsey, and he's the founder of On-Site Case Interview Coaching and the author of the book, The Elements of the Case Interview, so which is currently available for a pre-order on Amazon if you are interested. Um, so he has experience with helping PhDs and non-PhDs in navigating the consulting space, helping them prepare for case interviews and in general on business management. So today he'll talk about how PhDs can leverage their strengths in navigating this domain and help use those, leverage those strengths in solving problems related to casing. Okay, without further ado, I would like to give it to Manu. So please go ahead and welcome again.
Hey, thanks a lot, Iqbal. Perfect introduction. It's really highlights the relevant points of my background for today's topic. Uh, so it's well known that PhDs, we bring a lot of value to management consulting firms. That's why management consulting firms like McKinsey, BCG, Bain, many life sciences firms like Clearview, Putnam, and others recruit aggressively PhDs. What I sought out to do when I put this talk together, and the question that I was looking to answer that we don't have a good answer to, is shedding a light on a more precise understanding of what it is exactly that PhDs directly translate from their training into management consulting and into solving problems in management in the business world that directly translates, that we don't that we already spike in, that we already bring a strength in over others who work in the field, like those with the other backgrounds, like MBA backgrounds. But at the same time, what a more precise understanding of what it is that doesn't directly translate, that might be slightly different from the kind of problem solving that we do in academic research, that might be slightly different in management and in the business world, that we should be aware of so that we can mitigate and so that we can strengthen as we go and make this kind of transition. And as we prepare for, before the transition, as we prepare for the case interview. So I've had a unique vantage point in order to develop this perspective because I've been a case interview coach for the last over 3 years, working with clients from different backgrounds, all different backgrounds, MDs, MBAs, JDs, PhDs, and undergrads who are working on making that transition. I've helped them develop their problem solving skills. So I've gotten to see what kinds of skills they come in with as natural strengths. And I've also, I am a PhD myself. As Iqbal mentioned, did a postdoc as well at the NIH. So familiar with Maryland and the DMV area. And I've been through the interview process twice and worked in consulting. Before I talk about those specific strengths and weaknesses that we bring into solving problems in management and the case interview, a little bit about myself, additional information. So my PhD was in cancer imaging. I moved into consulting to bring the scientific method that we all get so good at applying in academic research to solving problems in management. Here are some pictures from my PhD dissertation, the X-ray imaging setup that I used when I was at Duke, a picture of one of the breast tissue samples that I imaged during my PhD for breast cancer imaging. I continued that research in X-ray imaging at the NIH during my postdoc. I then moved to McKinsey and Company. One of the motivations was to have a nearer term impact. Another one was I was inspired by the ideal of bringing the scientific method and the problem solving that we are so good at in academic research to solving problems in management. I found that I have a similar intellectual satisfaction in management and in consulting and solving business problems. And one of the reasons for that is getting to work on more interdisciplinary content, like on a daily basis, operations, strategy, finance, and innovation, and getting to work on more mainstream content. From McKinsey, I moved to DJO Global. It was an opportunity I couldn't turn down because I got to work with executives from the private equity firm Blackstone in order to turn the company around, grow its profitability 10% a year, and so that Blackstone could sell the company. And my long-term goals are to be a leader in the medical device or digital health space because of my PhD in roles of increasing responsibility. As Iqbal mentioned, I'm a founder of a case interview coaching company that I run. I've coached over 300 clients over the past 2 years, and I've enjoyed it a lot because it's helped me develop my coaching skills for success as a manager in my work, being able to coach and develop people, to learn how to deliver feedback. It's helped me maintain my problem-solving skill set and the best practices I learned at McKinsey as well. But most importantly, just it's been great just enabling the dreams of others. I've always a practice I've had is to whenever I get a really excited message from one of my clients who's gotten an offer from a firm they've been working hard to get an offer from, I always forward that to my mom, and it proves to her that I'm making a difference in someone else's life. My coaching philosophy is based on 3 pillars: helping my clients develop strong habits in the case interview during that conversation. Secondly, strong problem-solving skills, and that's where we're going to focus the entire time today, is on problem solving. And third, how to train in order to improve those other 2 areas. I realized that I really missed writing a dissertation. For those of you guys who maybe don't enjoy writing papers and don't enjoy writing your dissertation, you'll realize that if you ever move away from doing that, you're going to miss it. And so this year I wrote, or this past year, 2020, I wrote a book on my case interview coaching philosophy. It's actually became available on Amazon in paperback and ebook on January 1st. So now let's get into the case interview and consulting. First, just a definition of how I see what management consultants and consulting firms do. They help organizations improve their performance. So it's not limited to for profit. It includes nonprofits and governments. You can get a long list of management consulting firms online, but this is a curated list of firms that hire a significant number of PhDs. So these are the firms you should be aware of. Management consultants possess 3 skills. They're knowledge practitioners because they serve so many clients in a given function or industry. So they know best practices in that function or industry. Because they're constantly being exposed to brand new problems, they become very good at problem solving. And third, they work very closely in teams. So they become very skilled at teamwork. Only 2 of these are required below the partner level, problem solving and teamwork. And the scope for the remainder of the talk is going to be on problem solving. So now let's get into that initial question that I talked about at the beginning of how does the type of problem solving that we do in academic research compare and contrast with the type of problem solving that is done in the business world or in organizational improvement? To start answering that question, I first want to talk about the 6 types of requirements for problem solving that consultants face. Because problem solving is a very broadly used term. You can use problem solving to talk about even the types of problems that athletes face in a sport. Consultants face 6 unique requirements. The first is quantitative considerations. So They need to be able to back up any recommendations, any solutions to problems with quantitative data. An athlete doesn't have to do that, even though an athlete might still be doing problem solving. This is a unique characteristic of the type of problem solving consultants do. And this is where we do really well in academic research. We have this training. We're very, very comfortable and good at using quantitative considerations for our problem solving. So this is a strength that we come in with naturally. Second is qualitative considerations. In consulting, frequently you need to take into account organizational dynamics. You need to take into account customer psychology, competitors, potential risk, competitor response, and other kinds of risks as well, risks of implementation when you make when you think about a solution to a problem. And I think this is where research it tends to be a little different. And so, especially in my case, I come from, my research was in medical imaging, so more on the physical sciences side. I had very little experience using qualitative data. For those of you who might do more life sciences research, you might have a little bit more experience than I did using qualitative data. But this is an area where we need to be aware that there might be a gap, and we might not use as much qualitative data. The next one is data availability limitations. Oftentimes you need to, you may not have access to data that you need in consulting, like a competitor might be privately owned, and so you don't have that data about them. Or there might not be any data about the market size. This is another area where I think in research, especially in the physical sciences, I could always design an experiment and get the data I needed. It's something that is a little bit different from the type of problem solving we do. The next one is timeline limitations. In consulting, you need to be able to come up with a solution in a compressed period of time. Projects can be as long as several months, but in some cases they can be as short as 2 weeks if you're doing a due diligence for a company that is trying to make a quick decision about an acquisition and keeping that confidential. In research, we're expected to be so rigorous that we need to take as long as we need to get that p-value less than 0.05, for example. So another area where we need to be aware of our potential difference in the type of problem solving we do. Now, the next one is that the accuracy tolerance is actually, this is relative, really. Accuracy tolerance is lenient. I say it's lenient in consulting because it's lenient relative to what we're used to in academic research. Consultants actually, they're much more rigorous relative to their clients. Their clients make decisions with a lot less analysis. Consultants do a lot more analysis before making a recommendation. We do in academic research a lot more analysis, and so this is an area where we come in with a natural strength. This comes very natural for us, and it's something we need to be aware of, that we have this strength. And finally, communication is required. An athlete does problem solving, but they don't need to communicate that. Michael Jordan doesn't need to communicate why he decided to do something. But consultants do need to communicate the rationale behind a recommendation. And this is something we are very good at in academic research, because we're constantly communicating via talks at academic conferences and publications. What is the rationale behind our conclusions? And so that's a strength that we bring in. So we bring in 3 strengths here. Researchers such as PhDs at Hopkins face many of the same problem-solving requirements as consultants. We need to use quantitative data. We need to be rigorous, and we need to communicate our findings. There are a few that we don't face. Using qualitative data, having access to limited data, and having a limited timeline. To account for these additional differences, consultants have adapted the scientific method. By that, what I mean is that consultants have actually stolen the scientific method from us, from PhDs, because it works so well for problem solving, for quantitative considerations, for communicating your outcomes, and for being rigorous, most importantly. But they made a few tweaks in order to account for some of those differences, like limited data and limited timeline. So on the left here is the scientific method. Just for comparison, I've laid it out here. And I'm not going to talk about it because You guys are much better at it than me because I'm a couple of years removed from doing academic research. On the right-hand side, for comparison, I'm going to show you the McKinsey 7-step problem-solving approach that they've shared publicly in a book and in a podcast. This is what they use for solving their problems. And I want to make 2 points. First is that many of the steps in the 7-step problem-solving process map directly to the scientific method, and I've color-coded to show which ones map directly, right? The other point I want to make is that there's 3 steps here where there's been the 3 steps I've highlighted in this blue box, where they made a few tweaks in order to account for those differences on the prior slide. So to account for the difference of a limited timeline, consultants will structure their problem at the beginning of a project. What are all the things we need to investigate in order to come up with a solid answer for our client? Since we only have 2 weeks, or maybe in some cases longer than that, we need to lay that out on the table up front so that we're aware of it. And we need to prioritize issues so that, we only have 2 weeks, so we need to make sure we knock out this one bucket in the first couple of days because it's the most important, and it could change our analysis in the other buckets. And also, given that there's a limited data available, there's this plan analysis step. What data can we get? If there isn't market-sized data available, how do we modify our approach? But what you can see is that it's very similar to the scientific method. That's why, and that's a very important natural strength we bring in. There are a few modifications, and that's what we need to be aware of that are slightly different from what we usually do with the scientific method, and that we need to mitigate for. Before I get into how we can mitigate for those, I just want to touch on the case interview, because the case interview is the format that consulting firms use to test your ability to apply this 7-step problem-solving method. You're probably familiar with it, so I'll briefly provide an overview. It's about 25 minutes usually. The first 6 minutes are spent sharing a background about a hypothetical client, a situation. The next 7 minutes, the candidate spends some time putting together and presenting a structure, that upfront structure of what are all the important things that we need to analyze over the course of the project. And so this is something that we don't do as much in our PhDs because we don't have the limited timeline. We don't need to present an upfront structure necessarily for each project. It's something we need to practice a little bit. The next part is the analysis about the majority of the case. And this is what, the types of analysis that are done are usually brainstorming, interpreting data and exhibits, and doing calculations. And this is where PhDs really do well because our whole, we're constantly doing analysis in our PhD every day. And the final part, the last few minutes, is synthesis, presenting the conclusions to a hypothetical run-in with the CEO. PhDs do very well here because we're always presenting our conclusions and findings in talks and in papers. So now let's get into what are the, we've talked about what the differences are in the type of problem solving that we do between academic research and management consulting. How do we overcome those, or how would I express how that directly impacts case interview performance, and how do we overcome those? To translate this, to translate our problem solving skill, which we develop our ability to apply the scientific method, PhDs must overcome 6 easily surmountable challenges. And I really emphasize the easily surmountable part because the core part of the case interview, the 7-step problem solving method, is really comes directly from the scientific method. And we are already very good at that. There are really just a few tweaks that are made to that, that consultants apply. And so there really are tweaks, and they're easy to learn. First, let me talk about the things that we do well. And I'm presenting this in the context of the 3 types, the breakdown of the 3 types of problem solving. This is how McKinsey breaks out its scoring rubric for evaluating case interview performance. The first is structuring, your ability to break down a complex problem into its component pieces, to lay out a plan for analysis over the course of a project. The second is conceptual problem solving. which is your ability to creatively brainstorm solutions and to drive qualitative insights from data. And the final is quantitative problem solving, your ability to do mathematical analysis and to work with numbers to drive conclusions. PhDs they have 6 natural strengths coming in. And this is based on the differences we've talked about, similarities, and in my own experience just coaching clients from different backgrounds. PhDs tend to be hypothesis driven coming in. They have very good storylining ability, meaning the ability to support a conclusion with compelling arguments. And third, very good communication ability. I've been surprised to find that PhDs tend to be creative. Creativity comes naturally to them. And then they're rigorous and data-driven and mathematically competent. The translational challenge is based on the differences. So there are 6 of these. These are easy to surmount, easy to overcome. When it comes to structuring, I find that one of the challenges that PhDs face is discomfort with ambiguity. Because you're presenting the structure at the beginning of the case, where you're saying, hey, these are the things that we definitely, this is an exhaustive list of the things we need to do analysis within. It's a statement that you make up front that, hey, this is everything we need to look at. And this is the best way to present it. These are the 3 buckets or the 4 buckets. Because we as PhDs are so trained to be rigorous, we sometimes have discomfort with asserting, hey, that these are the 3 things that we need to look at. And that's something that just has to do with becoming more comfortable with that ambiguity. The second point is keeping communication high level first and prioritizing things before you get into the weeds or into the details. Because we as PhDs tend to be so rigorous that we tend to want to analyze everything that needs to be analyzed or that we think needs to be analyzed. We tend to get into the weeds early on, but it's important to present the high level first, and it's important to prioritize. And that's related to this third point about presenting the communication for the conclusion first, top-down communication. In our talks, we tend to present the methodology first and then the conclusions. Fourth is business knowledge. And by this, I want to make it very clear, business knowledge isn't necessary on the case interview, but because we don't have as much of it, it tends to hinder our confidence in brainstorming. We tend to not let loose and brainstorm of a high volume of ideas. And we tend not to enjoy brainstorming as much. You can see here that points 1 and 4 really have to just do with confidence, and that can easily be overcome. Under the math part, just being comfortable with making a sophisticated wild ass guess. This is consulting jargon for making an educated guess. So it's useful to be able to make a quantification of a number, even if it's just a ballpark estimate. But as PhDs, we tend to be wanting to get a number that's somewhat rigorous or somewhat close to being hypothesis tested or plus or minus 20% or 10%. But it's still useful to have a ballpark guess, and this is something we need to get comfortable with. I think that point 5 is another one that has to do with comfort and confidence. And point 6 has to do with teamwork skill. And what I mean by that is it specifically has to do with how you present your analysis and can you present it to your teammates. PhDs tend to use complex softwares like MATLAB or C++ or CAD softwares or R or whatever it may be. And we're not used to presenting our analysis to an audience. And that manifests itself in the case interview when you're doing math while someone's watching you and presenting each step of the math that you're doing in a calculation. This is something that MBAs may be better at because they use Excel a lot more, which is a software that's not as complex and it's intended for presentation to other people or sharing the work with other people. And so this is something that we just need to get comfortable with as well. With a little practice, these challenges are easily surmountable, but you need to be aware of them and dedicate some time to overcoming them. So now we're going to do a deep dive into a couple of these, 3 of these 6 areas. to better understand how we can overcome the challenge. The first has to do with the discomfort with ambiguity. In order to help you understand how you can overcome it, I want to give you a brief introduction to problem structuring on the case interview. And to do that, I want to use this hypothetical example from the Wall Street Journal about this company, Magic Leap, which is an American startup that released a head-mounted virtual retinal display called Magic Leap 1, which superimposes 3D computer-generated imagery over real-world objects. And the hypothetical situation is that Magic Leap is pivoting to business customers in a sales push. So the subtext is that after struggling to crack consumer markets with its augmented reality goggles, the venture-backed startup, Magic Leap, is turning to corporate training and healthcare. So they're turning to these two new customer segments. When we think about this in the context of the 7-step problem-solving approach, the first step is to define the problem. So let's say the problem is that Magic Leap has asked us, should we enter the healthcare market as a way to grow our revenue and valuation? Usually startups are focusing more on revenue and valuation. The second step of the 7-step problem-solving process is to structure the problem. A problem structure breaks down a large complex problem into smaller pieces to better manage it. Good problem structures entail two things. They're mutually exclusive, collectively exhaustive, meaning that the different categories or buckets or branches of your structure are independent of each other. They don't overlap. And taken together, they provide a exhaustive plan to provide a solid recommendation for Magic Leap. And they should be hypothesis driven, meaning each branch should be testing a hypothesis. So getting into the challenge for us, for PhDs, structuring a business problem is amorphous, meaning there's not a really, it's more of an, it's to some degree an art rather than a science, and that's okay. I think PhDs struggle with that ambiguity. As an example, here's how I would structure the Magic Leap problem. This is a framework for market entry from my book. However, there are many equally useful, valuable ways to structure this problem. You don't have to do it this way: market, client, and how to enter. You could structure it by valuation and revenue, this other structure, or revenue and costs, for example. And that's okay. The point I'm making here is that PhDs struggle with the ambiguity of structuring. The fact that there are many equally useful, valuable ways may make us feel that any structure that we present lacks rigor, something that we're trained to highly value, and that may make us uncomfortable, and therefore not as confident, and it may hinder our ability to come up with a structure that we are ready to get behind. Mitigating this challenge is not too difficult. You can memorize generic structures like this one from my book. You can use equation-based structuring like revenue and costs. Valuation tends to be related to profitability, so you can break it down into revenue and costs. You can focus on each metric of importance, like in this case, in the problem definition, we identified valuation and revenue as important. So that's a valuable structure. Or identify levers that drive value, like in this case, this structure here. So it's important, in order to get over your discomfort with ambiguity and to be more confident, you need to just practice. And so I've put together this homework problem for you. It has to do with your client, in this case is Disney. And once you do this homework, I'd be interested in seeing we're not going to have time to do it during the session today. But I would love to get an email from you and provide you feedback. But you can then repeat this with other articles from the Wall Street Journal or Economist magazine or any other publication. So the next one that I want to get into is this high level versus getting into the weeds prioritization skill. And the reason that I think this is important, one of the most important ones for us to talk about is just the prioritization skill that it's relevant, because we tend to, as PhDs, because we're so good in analysis, we tend to get into the weeds, into the details. And we tend to do that immediately. But it's important to stay high level a little bit longer and to prioritize before you do that. Now, on this slide, I want to talk about a couple of different case interview scenarios where this manifests itself. The first one is, so after the structure, when the interviewer asks you, after you present your structure, when the interviewer asks you what area would you like to explore first, a PhD, and I see this less at the PI level, would tend to start to step through their structure from left to right, really just arbitrarily pick where to start because they want to be exhaustive. But it's important, what a consultant would do would be to identify the biggest deal breaker issue. Like in the case of the Disney situation, film revenue is much more important than thinking about how the risks are going to play out. So it's important to identify that. And I think that film revenue is even more important than the costs that are going to be involved with streaming. So it's important to identify the highest priority item. Another example is when we have to do calculations in the case interview. Because we as PhDs find we're very mathematically competent, we tend to come up with the right methodology immediately. We just jump into the calculation and immediately start crunching the numbers. But what a consultant would do is to present a high level structure to relevant stakeholders like colleagues, the interviewer, or the client, in order to make sure that everyone's aligned on the approach, to get feedback on how the other stakeholders might modify the approach, so that you can get that before you go down a rabbit hole. That's important to do in the case interview as well. When you think about brainstorming, that part of the case interview, we might tend to speak excessively about our first idea and get into detail about how we would evaluate, for example, brand implications for Disney. But it's important because we don't know what the client or the interviewer is most interested in. It's important to present a breadth of ideas first. And this is also an important opportunity for you to present your creativity, to show it in the case interview. So you need to, instead of talking excessively about one idea, to present a breadth of topics, 7 different ideas in rapid fire, and see what the client or interviewer is most interested in. And then when we think about the hypothetical run-in with the CEO at the end, where you present the final recommendation or the synthesis, because we're so used to in our talks, especially, presenting the methodology first, we may tend to do that. We may be most comfortable doing that. But it's important because CEOs have very limited time and they might be interested in an area different than the one that you might spend more time talking about. It's important to present just a brief context and the conclusions that are relevant for their decision making, and then see what questions they have afterwards. So really taking your academic, the structure of your academic talks, conferences, and really moving the conclusion to the front. And I have a homework exercise for you about pricing strategy for the electric Hummer. So what I want to talk about next is I want to skip over to point number 4 about business knowledge, because my fear is that people will misunderstand this point as my saying you need to gain business knowledge in order to mitigate this gap. It's not necessary, but the absence of it can hinder creativity and confidence in the case interview. I want to talk about this hypothetical client context about casinos. During the pandemic, casinos have started offering their, they've been expanding their online business in order to offer at-home gaming options for their customers. So let's say that this is our client situation. We're at an analysis part of the case, and we're thinking about what are the risks involved with this decision, offering more at-home gaming options. This is how I would do this brainstorming. I would lay out 4 categories of types of risks: risks to the current business, risks to the hotels that the casinos, their hotel business, government regulation related risks, and implementation related risks. And then I'd lay out as many ideas as I could under each of the 4 categories. And my rule of thumb is you always, in the case interview, need to come up with at least 7 ideas. to exhibit your brainstorming creativity, and in order to be exhaustive. In this case, I came up with 11. And the point I want to make is that you don't need, due to PhDs, due to not having much business experience, would a PhD be comfortable asserting these ideas or have confidence thinking outside the box? What I mean is that you don't need an MBA to identify that there's going to be reduced food and drink revenue and reduced hotel lodging revenue if casinos start to offer at-home gaming options. However, because you may not be exposed to these problems as much, and you may not have as much experience brainstorming or thinking about these kinds of cases, you may not have the confidence to brainstorm some of these ideas. And so the way you mitigate that is by practicing brainstorming problems like these from business articles, like the Wall Street Journal. This particular article came from that particular publication, The Economist or Financial Times. So practicing that, making sure you practice coming up with at least 7 ideas across a breadth of categories. And then memorizing frameworks can be helpful as well. If you have a question, if you're facing a question about a typical business situation like entering a new market, if you know the framework for entering a new market, that can help you brainstorm ideas. And so here's a homework problem for you on brainstorming. So now I want to get into, just so that we have time for questions. And hopefully, Iqbal, you can share the slides so that you can take a look at the deep dive in the other 6 areas, or other 3 areas that we didn't get to cover. But now I'll provide an overview of all 6 about how you can implement this advice. So the little practice, you can translate your PhD problem-solving skill into the case interview. So first, with discomfort with ambiguity, you can follow the 4 tips on page 14, right? Memorizing structures, using equation-based structuring, thinking about the metrics of importance, thinking about what are the levers that drive value, so that you can assert one structure confidently and be exhaustive. Second, when it comes to staying high level versus getting into the weeds and prioritizing, you can train your mind to first focus on the 80-20. For example, anytime you put together a structure, what's the biggest value driver among your buckets in the structure? Another example is if you put together a to-do list every week or every day, really train your mind to think about what is the highest priority item. Number 3, top-down communication. So practice providing the answer first and then the methodology. This is another example where you're training your mind and you're training your communication style. Anytime you practice a case interview, really presenting the hypothesis first. For example, right now my hypothesis is that the client should do A. Here are some reasons, and then, but we still need to investigate a couple of other things before it becomes a conclusion. Another example is in your own research, whenever you come into the lab and you see your advisor for the first time in a week and they're asking you how things are going, what I would do during my PhD is I would share, well, these are all the experiments that failed last week, and that's what I start out talking about. But you should train your mind to start off with, hey, what's the latest insight that you've learned about a particular molecule, or just the latest insight that you've learned, and then share maybe the experiments that failed that led you to that conclusion. Number 4, business knowledge, having confidence and pleasure in brainstorming. You don't need to go get a bunch of business knowledge. You don't need an MBA, but you need to practice these brainstorming exercises, like the casino example that we did on page 23. And you can memorize frameworks as well. That'll allow you to just have more confidence and to enjoy the process of brainstorming, to come up with some of these ideas like the risks involved with offering at-home gambling options. Number 5, discomfort with sophisticated wild-ass guesses or educated guesses. We didn't get to do the deep dive here. However, I can give you you can take a look at the slides, and I can also give you a homework problem for this. The idea here is really, you want to be comfortable with developing a methodology and an approach to get an order of magnitude estimate. Like if a pharmaceutical company wants to look into going to a new market, they need to know whether the opportunities on the order of tens of millions of dollars or billions of dollars, because usually the R&D process is a couple of hundreds of millions of dollars. So they need to know whether what's the order of magnitude of the opportunity. For fun, whenever you go to your favorite restaurant in the a local restaurant in the Baltimore area or wherever, ask yourself when you're at the restaurant, can I ballpark what the annual profit or revenue is for this particular restaurant? Based on the limited data that I have, I know it's going to be a sophisticated wild ass guess. I just can see how many people are in the restaurant, the occupancy, the capacity. I can think about the seasonality. I know I have some idea from the menu prices what the average receipt amount is. See if you can estimate the annual revenue, and you'll find that it's, first of all, that it's a fun exercise. Second of all, that even though it's a sophisticated wild ass guess, it's informative. You'll be surprised at how useful the conclusions can be. You'll think to yourself, I'm surprised that a restaurant owner makes this much. Number 6, teamwork skill. You probably used to doing calculations and analysis in a sophisticated software like R or a CAD software or MATLAB or whatever. Practice now walking through math calculations using a presentable, clean, neat table, like we did on page 30. Doing that on paper or doing that in Excel in a way that is presentable, that you're confident to walk someone else through it doing it. And that's one of the challenges I've seen the PhDs have with the math. It's just presenting it. Here's some suggested publications and podcasts for practicing structuring and brainstorming. You saw many of the ones I presented today were from the Wall Street Journal, but I like these 2 others as well. And then here are three podcasts I like a lot that are useful as well. And here are some resources for frameworks, the 7-step problem solving approach, coaching, and the scientific approach to the case interview. I have these printable flashcards that are available on my website that have frameworks and other approaches. Practice case books, my book on Amazon that's available now for in paperback and ebook, and then my contact information. I'd love to stay in touch. So that's all I have. I wanted to save some time for questions.
Yeah, thanks, Manu. That was really great, and I really liked your idea of sitting down in a restaurant and trying to predict their revenue and how much money they're making. So that's a useful exercise. I'd try to read some of the questions that people have posted on the chat box. Hold on. So one question from FW is, do you use established framework or always create your own?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And to talk about it, I want to pull up this slide here. Yeah. Oops. Yeah, great question from FW about memorization. This is a very, there are really good approaches on both sides of this issue on whether you should memorize or whether you should create your own frameworks. I personally memorized, but I had a lot of friends who went through the case interview process and a lot of clients who were successful, who were against memorization. So I think both approaches work. There are pros and cons of both. I think the reason that I prefer memorization is because it's another tool in your toolbox that you can fall back on. And it's, some of us tend to get anxious during the 2 minutes where we have to come up with a structure. And if you have a memorized framework you can fall back on, that can reduce your anxiety. And then the last reason, the one that I think surprises people is, the last reason I think that memorization is the approach to go is because actually McKinsey and other consulting firms, they actually do that themselves. They actually take generic pre-made frameworks and they apply it for new clients, and they're proud of it as well. They share among their they share among their values. It's among their values actually to bring the best of the firm to each client, to bring the whole firm to each client, to bring one of the things that directly says this. One of their values you'll see on their website is to bring the best management practices to their clients. What does that mean? That means bringing the best frameworks to each of their clients, to bring the top management approach. That's another buzzword they use in their values. So I tend to take that approach. Come up with the best frameworks, or research the best frameworks from whatever sources you want. My book is one of those sources, and customize it as you see fit, to a point where it's easy for you to memorize, and to where you think this is the best approach for market entry, or this is the best approach for mergers and acquisitions, and bring it to a case. However, I want to make the point clear that it's critical to customize that framework for that client. You need to share specific hypotheses. Like in this framework, this right now is pretty generic, but I made an effort to include language here. Like if our client, for example, on a product, if our client does not have a product ready, then that would be a significant hurdle to overcome. So you want to customize that for Magic Leap, right? If Magic Leap does not have a healthcare virtual reality product ready, and how much is it going to cost for them to get that through the R&D process and through the FDA process? You want to make those kind of comments. So you want to customize. If you use this generic framework, you want to make sure you talk about the FDA and the product development process. So that would be my approach.
Yeah. So that, I guess, sort of answers the next question, that do you have a favorite framework, or do you have some frameworks that you like more than others? Yeah, I mean, we don't have more questions here, but I encourage the participants to unmute themselves and ask a question directly if they want.
Can I ask a question?
Hi, Jennifer.
Hi. So I'm wondering, how long does it take you to train an individual before they're interview ready? What is the length of time in terms of practicing cases on a regular basis before you would say somebody is interview ready?
Yeah, and that's to answer that. Great question, really. It's I remember thinking about that question a lot when I started the process, and to answer it, I want to share this. I want to talk about it in the context of this slide, because this slide shares kind of like you can think about it as 12 characteristics and which ones PhDs are good at. And I bring it up because I feel like there are some of my clients that really struggle with the math, mathematical competence. And for those clients, it takes a lot longer. I would say for those clients, and PhDs don't fall in this category, at least a couple of months. I'd say at least 3 months for people who are struggling with the math, because it just takes the longest to get comfortable with it to the point where you're confident enough to do it in that 25-minute conversation. But for PhDs, my typical, what I found, they need to work on these 6 things, right? And none of these take really that long. For PhDs, I would say really it's about 4 to 6 weeks, because you really just need to practice these things on a regular basis. If you're diligent about it, definitely within 4 weeks. And you need to make sure you just practice, maybe on a regular basis, doing some brainstorming questions by yourself. If you have some trouble with being organized, and walking through a math calculation, and working on your ability to present, to write it up and to talk through it in a presentable manner, doing that by yourself every few days. If you do those kinds of things, definitely within 4 weeks. But I think the key factor is whether you struggle with math. That really doubles or triples the time it takes. And when I say struggle with math, coming up with the methodology, being comfortable with it. I think PhDs still struggle with aspects of the math, presenting it in an understandable way, being comfortable with ambiguity. Those things can be taken care of very quickly, though. in a matter of weeks.
Thank you.
So I have a question, Manu. In one of your slides, you mentioned that not to get into the weeds, but rather stay on the top level and try to address those issues first, right? So you mentioned that valuation is more important than risk associated, something like that, right? So how does one understand among all these variables, which ones are more important, given that some of us do not have a business background, and we might as well learn some by reading all these journals, but it's important to find out which parameters are more important, are top level, and which are not so top level.
Yeah, that's a great question. Because when you lay out your structure, you may not necessarily you may not necessarily have enough data, right, to make that judgment. I think the most important thing is you need to deliberately, consciously think about a hypothesis. That's the most important thing. So that hypothesis can be informed by, and it needs to be a hypothesis informed by the data available. So that what that means is, first of all, was there some background information in the prompt that indicates to you that, hey, this profitability issue is more driven by revenue than costs? Like if it's an airline that's losing market share, I wouldn't start off looking at cost. I would have cost, if profitability is their goal, I would have costs in the structure for sure. But I would start off looking at the competition. Why are we losing market share competition? And so I would prioritize that. Because my hypothesis based on that information is that they're losing market share and therefore revenue, and that's what's driving the profitability decline. I think the other thing is thinking about which of your buckets depend on other buckets. Like if you have a risks bucket, that usually depends on the financials, right? The qualitative bucket oftentimes depends on the quantitative buckets. So I think I would look at those two things. How can you? What's the using your judgment and the information you have? What's the most advanced hypothesis you can put together? And what does that say about prioritization? And then the second is whether one bucket depends on the other.
I see. Okay, I think we have one more question and we'll wrap it up. So FW has asked another question again, whether there are tricks to get interviews from consulting firms, because I have applied to multiple positions and always get a generic answer that although we are impressed by your achievements, we did not decide to move forward with your candidacy. How to structure your resume to avoid such things?
Yeah, that's a great question as well. I think that the most, I bring up this slide here because I want to focus on these three areas. So the problem solving skill is usually assessed in depth in the case interview, and also as a PhD, that's kind of on paper, that's enough. That really is, it's a strong enough statement about your problem solving skill. So when it comes to getting the interview, the doubts and what you really want to use, what you really want to try to focus most of your effort on conveying on paper are the teamwork skill primarily. If it's a generalist firm, really just the teamwork skill, right? And that breaks down into your ability to influence senior people, your ability to lead teams, and your entrepreneurial drive or achievement. Now, if it's a life sciences firm like Clearview or Putnam, or a life sciences position at LEK, for example, then the knowledge practitioner component actually comes in as well. And so to FW's point, I think depending on, first of all, if it's a generalist firm, we really want to make sure that we flush out in his bullets and the resume and the experiences, those teamwork skills, right? Are there things that he's done, FW, that you've done that you can express in the bullets related to influencing skill? Did you influence an agency to provide you with funding? Did you influence a PI or a collaborator of a PI to pursue a project? that you designed. When it comes to leadership, did you lead a collaboration that in any manner across multiple universities or multiple labs within Hopkins, or leading any kind of leadership initiative within the Hopkins Graduate Consulting Club, those kinds of things for leadership. And then under achievement or entrepreneurial drive, if you can share bullets that show impact and potentially initiative as well. So we need to flesh out those 3 characteristics in the bullets for teamwork. If it's a life sciences firm, maybe you could do a better job of sharing the specifics of the research, the dissertation, how that may be relevant to the types of clients that Clearview, for example, is working with. Other topics, if you can share buzzwords about other topics within the specific academic space. But I think those are the 2 things that I wanted to touch on in terms of skills. I think the other thing that's important to keep in mind is the networking side of this, right? I think that includes right now with the virtual channel, showing interest and reaching out to and attending these events and taking that personalized approach as well when it comes to networking, getting internal referrals from consultants, setting up conversational interviews with consultants as well as with partners who you may meet through these virtual events, and who you may reach out to online, who you may have some mutual connection with. And then recruiters are always looking for talent. And I think reaching out to recruiters through cold messaging is very effective as well, because these consulting firms are only as good as the talent they bring in. And so that's in their best interest to talk to you.
Right. And I guess we have one last question, which is Kaman is asking, I did my research using using a qualitative methodology. Would you suggest I go back and get a degree in analytics or data science?
Oh, no, not at all. Come on. I don't think that a degree is something that is necessary at all. I think it's a great strength to come in with qualitative research experience. I think what you just need to do then is, again, I think the problem-solving skill on paper that you bring on paper is strong enough without any additional degree. But we need to think about when you prepare for the case interview. Moving over to this slide, you might have to spend a little bit more time working on this mathematical competence possibly. And as I found in my coaching, that is what takes longest to develop. So if you have any kind of, if you feel like you have less mathematical competence relative to engineering PhDs who are also interviewing, you need to start preparing for the case interview earlier, because that takes the longest time. And so I think that's what you need to do.
All right, I think we should wrap up. It's already 1 p.m. And thanks a lot, Manu. And everyone, please join me in thanking Manu. And you can assume that everyone is clapping with me, even though their screens are not visible. Once again, you can get in touch with me or Manu, and I recommend you buy his book and practice again and again for your interviews. Good luck to you all, and we'll meet again in next week again with another guest. And thanks again.
Thanks everybody. Thanks so much everybody for attending today, and thanks a lot to the club for this awesome opportunity. Thank you guys.
All right.
Thank you.